My name is Duncan Noble, and I'm going to be your moderator today. First of all, I wanted to give a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us. This is the first public event for Engineers for Carbon Ethics, and we're very excited about it. We have a lot of people attending today from countries all around the world. Yesterday we had to look up a few country codes to figure out who was registered for this event. As I said, my name is Duncan Noble. I'm one of the founding members of Engineers for Carbon Ethics. And what you should see on the screen now is the agenda for today. First of all, I'll introduce our organization and our president, Yannick. And then I'll hand it over to Andrew Gage from West Coast Environmental Law, and he'll go on with his presentation. We should have lots of time for questions today, so be sure to think about questions during Andrew's presentation. You can type them into the GoToWebinar question box. As Jeanette says, you can raise your hand if you want to voice your question. And you can also ask questions on Twitter using the hashtag CarbonEthics. So, Engineers for Carbon Ethics. We're a new organization. We're an international association of engineers who recognize the ethical dimensions of climate change in our profession. We started last year. Most of us met at a Climate Reality Project meeting in Chicago last summer. So as engineers or people with an interest in engineering, naturally we're passionate about technology, but we also recognize that technology is not enough for the challenge of climate change. Low carbon technology is clearly a necessary foundation, but it needs to exist in a cultural and ethical context. So I'm going to show you quickly our vision and mission as an organization. We recognize that global warming goes to the heart of engineering ethics, and one of the key aspects of engineering ethics is to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. I won't read the entire vision and mission statement there, but you can see how it goes. Our mission really is to mobilize engineers to embrace climate responsibility in every aspect of professional practice. So clearly today's webinar is an important sort of milestone in terms of introducing some of the concepts of professional practice and climate change. What do we mean when we talk about engineering ethics? I'm sure Andrew's going to go into this in more detail, but I did copy the definition out of Wikipedia. It's actually a pretty good article which talks about the different sort of history of engineering ethics as well as some of the ethical codes that are out there. And I'm sure any of you who are engineers, licensed professional engineers, the association you're a part of probably has some kind of code of ethics which will talk about the duty of engineers to different groups within society. With that as background, I now want to introduce Yannick Trottier, who's you should be able to see on your screen. He is the owner and engineer of Geotrope, which is a geothermal energy company, and he's also a founding member and president of Engineers for Carbon Ethics. Yannick has a degree in aeronautics and astronautics engineering from MIT. He's a licensed professional engineer and has 15 years of experience. Yannick's personally determined to do all he can to address global warming and slow down climate change. And after some careful reflection, Yannick decided that the best way he could do this was to quit his job as a nuclear engineer and start a company that installs geothermal energy heat pumps. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. We're really excited to have Andrew Gage from West Coast Environmental Law here today. He's the head of West Coast Environmental Law's Climate Change Program, and he writes on professional, legal, and other risks arising from climate change and their solutions. So clearly, today's webinar is right in his sweet spot. While at West Coast, Andrew has worked on a wide range of environmental issues, aside from climate change, including forestry, workplace exposure, and pesticides. During law school, Andrew helped found the University of Victoria's Environmental Law Center, and he also volunteered with the noted First Nations environmental lawyer, MC Mehta, before joining, or that's Indian environmental lawyer, I guess, before joining West Coast in 2001. So with that all as context and background, I'm very pleased to introduce Andrew Gage, who's going to be our presenter today and talk about engineers and climate change. Thanks very much. Jeanette, can you hand it over to Andrew?
Hi, everyone. First of all, thanks very much to Engineers for Carbon Ethics for asking me to do this presentation, and for all of you for joining us. West Coast Environmental Law is one of Canada's oldest public interest environmental law organizations. We've been around for over 35 years now. Our involvement in climate change we've been involved in climate change for a long time as well. We were part of the official Canadian delegation to Kyoto when the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated, and I think we continue to try to find ways to use the law and legal tools to advance to address climate change, both fighting climate change emissions and also adapting to helping society adapt to the fact that we are going to get some significant rises in global temperature, even if we're successful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Our interest in, obviously as lawyers, we are professionals, we're not engineers, but we have our own ethical requirements, and we're very familiar with the requirements of professional associations, professional codes of conduct, and the like. And we really started wondering, a few years back, about whether there was a role for professional associations and their members to play to more systematically address climate change. Because the reality is that professionals deal with climate change in many cases on a daily basis. But although these professionals are advising government and advising industry on how to deal with these problems, there had been very little public discussion about whether there was a role for the professional associations and what the implications of climate change are for professional ethics and professional responsibility. So we published a report in 2011, Professionals in Climate Change, that really, I think, is the first public report, as far as we're aware, anywhere in the world that looked at these issues. Some individual professional associations had begun grappling with these issues, but in terms of an organization outside of a professional association, our report, I think, is the first to really sort of put forward a public position of here's how professional associations can take a more active role and really play an important role in helping to address climate change. So I'd like to start by just recognizing that climate change is already occurring. This is a slide of a pipeline in a northern region where the permafrost is actually melting underneath the pipeline, causing it to buckle, creating all manner of engineering and other challenges and environmental challenges, of course, from the reality of climate change. And of course, there's an irony here in that this pipeline is presumably carrying fossil fuels and is contributing to the very problem that it has not been well adapted to deal with. In Canada, climate change is estimated in just a few years to be costing us $5 billion each year, and that's going to rise to between $21 billion and $43 billion per year by the 2050s if we are successful in limiting global rises in greenhouse gases to a 2-degree Celsius temperature rise. So if we're not successful in that, of course, the rise will be much greater, and the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy said it could be as much as a quarter of Canada's GDP. Of course, other figures may be even higher. This is a fairly, I think, in some ways, a fairly conservative estimate. So this is already happening, and it's in many cases it's professionals that are on the forefront of dealing with these problems. Both dealing with the question of how to mitigate climate change and how to adapt our systems, our infrastructure to address rising sea level, or sorry, rising temperature levels and the impacts of climate change. These are just a few examples, very arbitrary, ones to illustrate some of the roles that professionals are playing. There, of course, are many others. But I think we need to be aware that professionals do play a key role. Now, before we go any further, I want to get a sense of who is in the audience. This webinar is actually directed, of course, to engineers, although other professionals are very welcome to join us. I'm going to first ask you to answer a poll on whether you are an engineer or a member of some other profession or not, and that's fine. We just want to sort of get a sense of who's on the call, on the webinar. Okay, we've heard back from 92% of you. It tells us how quickly people are voting. If there's anyone who hasn't voted yet and wants to, please do, and I will go ahead and close the poll in just a second. Okay. And I need to share the results. So you can see, there's a little more than half have an engineering degree. I can include student engineers. Slightly more than that. Got about a quarter of us from other professions, and that's interesting. So I will just close that and then move on to my next question, which may be more relevant for those of you who are professions. But I wanted to know whether any of you are observing climate change impacting your work already. Whether that be through client expectations, through changes in regulations, through changes in the climate. You should be able to, if this is working properly, vote for more than one category. If that's not working, let us know, because that would be good for us to know, but we're not, we probably can't change it at this point. It'll just be good feedback. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and share it. The numbers make me think that maybe it didn't actually allow multiple voting, but please let us know in the questions. It looks like it does add up to 5. Close to slightly below 100%. All right. So that's good. I mean, the point is that I wanted to really make here is that professionals are already seeing impacts on the ground of climate change, either in actual impacts that they have to deal with, or changes in the client's expectations, or changes in regulations. So this is a reality that professionals are dealing with now. Okay, my apologies for the problems on the polling. We're obviously still learning with our technology. It sounds like you weren't able to vote for more than one on the second poll. But anyhow, back to the presentation. The point is that this is a reality that we are dealing with already. And what I'm going to touch on, similar to, I'm really going to cover the same content that we wrote about in Professionals in Climate Change, although perhaps in a slightly different organization, or a different format than we did it in the book. It just seemed to work better for this webinar. This is sort of our outline for the issues I'm going to touch on. And excuse me, the role of professional associations in addressing these addressing climate issues. So the first thing that I think is a responsibility and really is important for all professional associations and all professionals is to recognize the urgency of climate change. And this really cuts across all the other points here, because the whole point is that you can't just say, oh, climate change is some problem, we can put it to one side. But it really is a cross-cutting issue that has sweeping implications for every aspect, or can have sweeping implications for every aspect of the professional's responsibility and ethics. And we're already seeing some conversations along these lines. The Ontario Society of Professional Engineers made this statement in 2009. It sees climate change as an issue for this generation. But they frame it in a way that really almost is marketing for the profession, in which engineers in the engineering profession will play significant roles related to the design and application of solutions. And I think the challenge for professional associations is not merely to jump on board climate change as an opportunity for their members, but to actually recognize the challenges and as well as the opportunities. The Canadian Institute of Planners did I think a fairly good job in their statement on climate change, where they basically recognize that it's going to affect all aspects of their mission, and the statement as a whole includes a number of reiteration of findings from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and really I think does a good job as a whole of recognizing some of the more scary realities of climate change. They also, unlike I think most examples we've been able to find at professional associations, specifically say that because of the urgency, they're going to champion action on climate change policy nationally and internationally. That's an unusual step that they've taken, and it's one that we certainly applaud. The APEG BC just earlier this year put out a climate change position paper. We're going to mention APEG BC a lot, both because they're engineers and because my organization's based in British Columbia, but also because they really have been showing a lot of leadership on climate change. Their position paper, I think, contains a number of statements that do recognize a fairly high level of urgency, or certainly that the implications are sweeping and have some major challenges for their members. Now, the first point, if you recognize the sweeping nature of climate change, the first point we have to recognize is that climate change is a public safety issue. Engineers, there's different variations of this depending on the code, let's say the provincial body or the professional association, but really the idea of holding paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, the protection of the environment, and promoting health and safety within the workplace being central to the responsibility of engineers is common to many or all of the codes of ethics. I think it's important to say that it's the nature of a profession that you have responsibility to the public, and not just to your employer. That's basically part of the definition of being a professional, is that you're not just doing what you're paid to do, but you're also exerting a higher level of ethics that recognize the broader societal implications of social implications, in some cases environmental implications of what you're doing. And with the engineers, they really emphasize the safety, health, and welfare of the public as being a major part of that. Similarly, APEG Alberta, in their guidelines for ethical practice, specifically talk about what holding paramount public safety, health, and welfare means, and specifically that this creates a positive responsibility to guard against conditions that are threatening to the life, safety, and longer-term health, financial matters, societal welfare, or sustainable development within our environment. And APEG BC had a task force before its current climate change committee, which I'll mention a bit later. They had a task force looking at climate change issues, and the task force, I think, really got this right when they said that the first tenet of the Code of Ethics states that professional engineers and professional geoscientists shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, protection of the environment. Climate change is a public safety issue. And we've already talked about the damages that climate change is already causing and is projected to cause. Those numbers are greater globally, of course, than in Canada. The current estimate is that climate change is already causing in the neighborhood of $600,000 of damages a year. Sorry, $600 billion of damages a year globally, and if you can consider all of the impacts of the fossil fuel economy, so the climate impacts, but also the pollution, more direct pollution impacts, the number is estimated at $1.2 trillion a year globally, and 400,000 deaths. If it's a public safety issue, then that relates very closely to the ethical responsibility to act with due diligence, to act competently. What does due diligence mean in the light of climate science? Well, up till now, most professions, and certainly including engineers, have assumed that we can learn from what happened before and to just apply those lessons to the future. Climate change changes that in that we now know that the climate will not stay static during the lifetime of some of the major projects that these engineers are building. What does this mean in terms of what climate science means? Well, engineers have an opportunity, the responsibility to act with due diligence, to act competently. That can be defined either by the professions themselves going forward, or if there's not action to define that, it'll eventually be defined by either legislation or by the courts through litigation. And so, it's important to think about this. What does due diligence mean in light of climate change? And APEG BC, I think, begins to touch on that in their recent position paper, which is, I think, well worth a read if anyone hasn't seen it. Engineering should be carried out with appreciation of the changing climate. Some registrants are already being asked to consider the changing climate in their work, for example, through professional practice guidelines on legislative flood assessment in BC. This is likely to continue, and there will be a need to fill any gaps identified. So a recognition that they are already having to incorporate climate change into professional practice guidelines, and that they will continue to do that. And certainly, if you read the position paper as a whole, the APEG BC is committing to actually play an active role in developing that type of guidance. But the task force that APEG BC had in 2010 was went even a little further, I think, talking about the obligation of professionals to incorporate best practice standards for climate adaptation and mitigation into existing and future practice guidelines, including developing a series of questions that were more generic that could be put to engineers working in these fields, asking whether they've considered the changing climate in the design, have they met illegal obligations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, have they considered life cycle costing, have they considered increasing cost of energy. In Professionals in Climate Change, we posed a slightly different set of questions related to what needed to be addressed by best practices and the obligation to look at public safety. These were our questions, or our issues, I guess, that we thought needed to be addressed, or we could credibly say should be addressed in order to address the public safety and the public issues related to climate change more generally. So identifying and proposing options to manage greenhouse gas emissions, considering the climate change impacts where adaptation could be an issue, being aware of future requirements and costs associated with regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. This is essentially the carbon bubble debate that's happening right now. Considering and advising clients on alternatives that minimize greenhouse gas emissions or improve resilience of the project in light of a changing climate. Now, some engineers have said not so much, to us, well, if I'm hired, the client isn't hiring me to look at climate change. They're hiring me to look at some specific design element or something. To which we generally say, well, as a lawyer, if I'm hired to draft a contract, and I become aware that that following the contract will make the client guilty of defamation, I can't not mention that. I still have an obligation to the client and to the public to make the client aware of the risks that they are taking on. And similarly, if climate change is going to have a major impact on the project, I would suggest it's the responsibility of the engineer to deal with that aspect, or at least draw to the client's attention that there may be very significant aspects of that need to be looked at. So the other major implication of recognizing the urgency of climate change for professional ethics revolve around concepts related to knowledge and expertise, and the various obligations, there's many obligations that professionals have related to their professional expertise, because that's what what makes them a professional. So this is an excerpt from the BC APEG BC Code of Ethics, and it specifically just mentions the importance of making their decision entirely on adequate knowledge and honest conviction, and keeping themselves informed so as to maintain their competence. So there's there's more than two aspects of it. There's many aspects that flow out of this, many professional issues that flow out of this, including the need for continuing professional education and training, the requirement not to speak beyond an expert's expertise, really to make sure if you are dealing with issues that you don't know about, to go and get the expert help you need to make informed recommendations. The requirement not to make misleading or inaccurate factual statements or falsify data. And the fact is, there are lots of examples of experts speaking beyond their expertise and really speaking to issues that, in a way that's perhaps less than professional. This is less about professionals, but just an affirmation from an affirmation from a professional body that falsifying data in relation to climate change it could be a breach of professional conduct, professional ethics. And then there are a number of a simple Google search on declarations by scientists who question climate change will turn up the Oregon petition, the Manhattan Declaration, and various other statements where scientists and engineers and other professionals are signing on to statements saying that climate change is not real, it's not happening, and using their credentials to say that this is a statement being made by scientists who know what they're talking about. Well, the Oregon petition has 30,000 signatures, and a review of them found that 0.5% of them were people who even claimed, who had self-identified in any way as being related to a field that related to climate science. So there are a great many people who are speaking beyond their professional competence. And I think that clearly raises some ethical issues. It's not so much that professionals can't say, I have questions about climate change, but if they're using their credentials to say this is what is true, or if they are holding out to their clients that they're acting on the basis of the best information available to them, they're not, and that raises professional issues. And similarly, there's the requirements related to continuing professional development, to continue training oneself in science that relates to one field, to bring in experts where there's issues that go beyond your expertise to assist. And the recent APEG BC position statement again recognizes the obligation of APEG's members to keep themselves informed about the changing climate and to consider the potential impacts of that information on their professional activities. Our suggestions are that professional associations need to offer climate change training to their existing members, but they actually need to go beyond that and offer mandate continuing education, make it a requirement, particularly for individuals working in fields that really directly relate in some way to climate change. But more and more, that's almost everyone for certain fields, for certain professions. Knowledge of climate change should actually be assessed as part of registration requirements and practice reviews. And it's not just us saying that. The last recommendation actually was a recommendation of the task force, the APEG BC task force from 2010. The other way that professional associations can recognize the urgency of climate change and act on it is less in the professional ethics realm and more in just their basic organization. Just making a commitment, just publicly recognizing that climate change has professional ethics implications and what that means is what something the association should be doing rather than something individual members should be doing. I mean, both should be doing it, but it's very important for the associations to recognize that. Associations can and should commit to integrating climate change into association decisions. They can develop climate change advisory committees, and this is being done more and more, at least here in BC. The engineers here have a climate change committee. The foresters have a climate change committee. I believe the Institute of Agrologists have a climate change committee, and there's discussion. I'm aware of discussion in other on other professional associations of setting up similar bodies. And finally, collaborating with other professional associations. Many of the issues being raised around how do we deal with this changing climate are ones that are in common with what professional association has in common with other professional associations. There are huge opportunities to work together on these issues and to make the seriousness of climate change known to the professionals and to the public generally through collaboration between professional associations. I can't say much about it at this point, except to say we actually have been meeting with a number of professional associations that are having some of these types of conversations in BC, and been encouraged by the willingness of people from a variety of different professions to talk together and explore ways to collaborate. Now, this is something we didn't talk about in professionals in climate change, but I mentioned it earlier, and it's something that I'm often asked about, so I included a few slides about it at the end of this presentation. I mean, obviously, we want professionals and professional associations to act to address climate change because it's the right thing to do, because they are mandated to protect public safety and the environment, and it's a matter of good professional ethics to deal with climate change and the issues posed by climate change. But if professional associations don't, it is going to have an impact on the profession sooner or later. And I think that it'll have an impact on individual professionals as individual professionals are sued, resulting in damages awards, damages to their reputation, costly litigation, and it'll also have profession-wide implications on insurance, on the credibility of the profession. So if it is far better for professional associations to deal with these issues proactively than to be dragged to the table kicking and screaming when lawsuits materialize. Now, that's not just our view. Torrey's LLP is one of the larger law firms in Canada, and they were asked to examine the possible liability of different parties in relation to infrastructure projects in the far north and the impact of climate change on those infrastructure projects. This was commissioned by the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy, and as part of a report they were doing. And I was asked when I received permission to talk about this opinion, when I saw, looked for permission to share this opinion with people, that I was asked to emphasize that the legal opinion does not necessarily represent the views of the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy. Of course, the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy has since been disbanded by the federal government, so I guess we'll never know what their views on this particular issue were. But in terms of the legal analysis, they went through various categories of parties that could be held liable, and design professionals and contractors, both of who could include engineers, were definitely parties that were found to be liable. This is specifically liable for I should be clear here. These lawsuits they were looking at were specifically around a failing to adapt to climate change. So damages that occurred because of changes in the climate that impacted infrastructure, which should have been considered and weren't. This law firm concluded basically that both the design professionals and contractors were both groups that could be held liable potentially if a project fails and infrastructure fails, and there are impacts arising from a changing climate. So in closing, professionals are on the front line of adapting to climate change and in conducting activities that are impacted by climate change. They're relied upon by government and industry in relation to those mitigation and adaptation efforts, and they can advise their clients on how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or to reduce the risks associated with climate change. They are therefore on the forefront of addressing climate change, and that's the reality, whether professionals rise to the occasion or not, and we'd much rather that they do. So a couple of questions I'd like to pose before we just open it up for general discussion for you to think about is, what is the role of professionals in advising industry and government on how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and in managing the impacts of climate change? And what's the role of professional associations in encouraging or requiring their members to play that role? We've sort of given you some of our answers to that, but we're interested in hearing your views on those questions. And with that, I think we can turn it over to questions and discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. This is Duncan here, the moderator. And I'll just see if there's any sort of hands up for people that want to speak to those questions. Do you just want to repeat those questions for the audience again, Andrew?
Sure. So what's the role of professionals in advising industry and government on how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and in managing the impacts of climate change? And what's the role of professional associations in encouraging or requiring their members to play that role? But of course, I mean, we're also happy to hear questions about the presentation or other issues that anyone wants to discuss.
I don't see any hands up, so maybe I'll direct that question towards Yannick if he cares to address it.
There are some written questions as well, though.
Yeah, we've got a couple of written questions here. We've answered some of them, but maybe we'll just start with that question. Is that something you'd like to address, Yannick?
Certainly. Yeah, if you can put the question back up, make sure that I don't miss anything. But in general, I think that it's important for engineers to take a leadership role in addressing climate change. We have a special responsibility among other professions in that we've been responsible for the design of a lot of these machines that have been putting out the carbon emissions that are now giving us trouble. And we have the expertise to understand what's going on, to understand the impacts on industry and on society. And we also have the expertise to be able to offer alternatives to the public. Scientists have been in the lead position in understanding what the problem is, what the scope of the problem is, but engineers should be in the lead position in encouraging solutions to the problem, both on the mitigation side and on the adaptation side. Is that
Great.
Do you want to press me further on that?
Nope, there's a couple of questions here that I think would be good to highlight, and there's a few that have been asked and answered. I don't know if everyone can see the answers, but Greg had asked about one of the polls. We were asking really about engineers versus non-engineers, and he had asked about we left off professional agrologists who are obviously active around climate change.
Right, and they are, and I think that was simply an issue of the space we had on the slide, Greg, and I'm sorry for the arbitrary choice of professions that we included, and I'm sure there are other professions that were left off that list as well.
Yeah, we were particularly interested in just how many people here are engineers versus other professions. Anna asked if the report Professionals in Climate Change is available online, and yes it is. You can download it from the West Coast Environmental Law website. I've given the website there.
And we can include when we'll send an email out after this with a copy of the recording of the webinar, and we can also include a direct link to that report and a link to the APIC-BC position paper.
Okay, great. Here's a question from Rachel Jonason, and I apologize in advance if I've slaughtered your name. And her question is, I'll direct this to you, Andrew, I think, but Yannick certainly feel free to respond. Professionals are usually responsible for problems that arise that were, quote unquote, reasonably expected. Mm-hmm. And then she goes on to say, do you think that the GCM projections provide sufficient basis for this expectation? So she's talking about, go ahead.
So there is more and more information available about what the projected changes in climate are. So yes, I mean, I think increasingly there is enough information there that if you haven't even looked at it and tried to model what's there, then that's going to be a problem from a liability point of view. or from a professional ethics point of view. If you've looked at it and concluded that based on the information that's there, there's a range of possible scenarios, and you've picked one that's realistic and somewhat precautionary, like not taking terrible risks, and it turns out you picked the wrong scenario, then I think you're fine. But if you haven't even looked at it and seen what modeling exists and tried to take a responsible course of action based on the information that's available, then I would think that there's a basis for holding the professional responsible.
Great. Here's a question from Sylvie Sprackman, and she's asking what can a member of one of these professions do to help advance their own association's response to climate change?
Yeah, well, I think asking your association what they're doing on climate change, pressing them to have an advisory committee or other bodies, joining groups like Engineers for Carbon Ethics, if there is one within your profession, and pressing for action from the outside are all positive steps. There are, it's my understanding that the foresters, the Association of BC Forest Professionals, struck their committee after a resolution came to the floor of their annual general meeting calling for such action. So there's the possibility of participating through the democratic process within your association and raising these issues and pressing the association to take action.
Can I speak to that question as well?
Of course.
I think that there's a big need for professionals to speak up much more loudly about this, certainly in the engineering field. The engineers have been relatively silent compared to where I think we should be about the risks of climate change and what the alternatives are. There are so many ways in which we could be helping. A lot of the engineers on this call will know that some of the solutions that have been proposed to climate change, some of the carbon mitigation solutions that have been proposed, don't make any sense. But they gather large followings because no one is really helping to educate the public about the differences between the good solutions and the bad ones. We're still, so much of the public debate, of course, is about whether climate change is happening or not, and we need to be moving beyond this, or at the very least be getting ready to move beyond this and educate the public as to what the good solutions are, educate our clients, and speak within the profession about this. There are many associations of engineers that have essentially an established view that climate change is not our concern. This needs to be changed through more discussions by bringing it up in elections to the governance of associations, and by writing into your professional association magazines and by speaking out at conferences.
Great. Thanks for that, Yannick. There's lots of questions coming through here, so I'm going to try to address as many as we can in the time available. A question from Kaylee LeDrew, or again, I apologize if I've not pronounced your name correctly. Kaylee says, I work for a consulting firm and I find the issue isn't that the engineers are not being willing to offer alternatives, but that the issue is more around clients accepting them. Do you, either Andrew or Yannick, have any advice regarding dealing with clients who perhaps are somewhat reluctant to accept designs that take climate change into effect or into concern?
Do you want to take that first, Yannick? Or I mean, I can take a shot at that, but I'm not an engineer. It seems to me that it's going to be somewhat different for each profession. And
well, I hope that I'll be able to throw another question back at you. My position on that would be that, first of all, you have a duty to warn. You have to duty to warn the client of what the impacts would be of their decision. And the legal liabilities that could arise later on if this is a big infrastructure project that winds up being found to enhance climate change in the future in a world when it becomes clear to everyone and lawsuits come up. And in some cases, you may have, if the project is particularly bad, I would say in the situation of a client who wants to build a coal plant, a new coal plant without carbon capture and storage nowadays, I would say in that situation, an engineer would have a duty to withdraw from the project. Just as a doctor cannot accept to perform an operation that is too dangerous, an engineer cannot accept every project. And if the project goes ahead anyway, the engineer may even have a duty to warn the public about the damages that this project can cause to the public. You know, how close am I to the legal realities on this, Andrew? One of the things I wanted to ask you about was the duty to warn. Isn't that one of the duties we have?
If you're warning related to liability, then there's sort of a question about what the legal reality is there. I think for adaptation issues, so you're building infrastructure and you're concerned it may fail due to changing climate. I think that the duty to warn, I mean, I think that the legal issues actually are not that challenging. I mean, there's a question of whether the lawsuit would actually materialize just because of the cost of litigation. But if it was a large enough, project, I mean, absolutely, there's a basis for liability. If, in my opinion, there's a basis for liability if someone is failing to consider the likely impacts of climate change on the project, and that's putting public safety at risk. And if the professional doesn't warn and make it very clear, and possibly even take the types of strong measures that Yannick's talking about, there's a risk to them that they may find themselves liable as well. I think as long as they've warned and been fairly clear about it, they probably are okay on in terms of protecting themselves. But of course, putting that warning on the record would be a problem for the client if they went ahead with the project and the damage, the failure occurred. In the case of projects where large-scale emissions are actually contributing to climate change, I think the risks there have been underestimated, and that type of litigation may become a reality. I'm increasingly convinced it will actually become a reality, but that's not a majority view among lawyers. You'd probably have to, if you were concerned about whether there was some, I think you can raise it as a concern for the client that there could be some liability if they go ahead with this, but I'm not able to say there's necessarily that it would be viewed as having breached an obligation, given that most lawyers in Canada would have some major questions about whether or not that type of lawsuit would happen or not. Does that? I would say more generally on sort of advice regarding clients. We tried not to tell professional associations or other professions, here's what your duty is. Your duty is to walk away or not, simply because, I mean, we're lawyers. It's not my business to tell engineers, here's what due diligence requires. I can raise the questions of are you considering climate change? Here's some things that other engineers have done related to climate change. But exactly where that dividing line between professionally negligent and professionally responsible lies, we're not really in a position to say that. But I do think that Yannick's quite right that the act of putting something on the record that this is a concern, I think in an era where people are trying to at least have an appearance of acting responsibly on some of these issues, I think could have a fairly major effect, in that acting cautiously and not even raising the issue or raising it in a very cautious manner probably undermines the message that this is urgent. in any other context, if an engineer felt that something that they were doing might contribute to the loss of life, they clearly would say that in very strong and unapologetic terms. With climate change, it's a little more difficult because we are in an economy where this is the reality. It's very difficult to escape from the reality of that we're all dependent on fossil fuels. But I think there's certainly a need to raise the issue and to recognize that the very serious implications of what we're doing. We are talking about the loss of lives ultimately if the economy as a whole moves the way. Well, I mean, it's already occurring. So it isn't overstating it to say that this goes right to the heart of public safety.
Great. We really only have time for a few more questions.
I guess we had someone who raised their hands, and if we can actually have someone on the speaker, that might be a good change of pace.
Great. Well, maybe I'll start with Spencer Gore. Spencer's got a fairly long and involved question, so if he could ask that. If Jeanette,
looks like he's on. He maybe. Oh, here he is. Spencer, you're unmuted.
Perfect. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
All right, great. Well, my question has to do with sort of tracing back engineering liability on the other side. We've talked a lot about how an engineer or a group of engineers responsible for a public works project or something similar like that could be held liable if planning was not done to account for the impacts of climate change. I'm really curious in the legal mechanisms of liability going the other way, dealing with the causes of climate change. Ultimately, we know that climate change is caused by the cumulative emissions of hundreds of millions or billions of systems of fossil combustion, and presumably for the past 30 years or longer than that, most engineers who have designed those systems have been cognizant of the impacts that they would have on the climate, namely that every car engine, every power plant, every gas stove in some way is contributing to a global problem, which is creating a real toll on actual lives and actual economies. Are there any legal mechanisms in existence today which can trace back the damages that are caused to real people by a changing climate to the engineers who have signed off on systems which are hurting the planet? And if there aren't any legal mechanisms, what mechanisms would need to be developed?
Okay, so we have a webinar on next week, sorry, a week and a half or so, April 11th, I think it is, on causation in climate change litigation. And this is the question of whether you can link particular emissions to particular damages and what that means for liability. And this is, I think, one of the major challenges for litigation in related to climate damages, and it's certainly it's probably one of the reasons that so few Canadian lawyers believe that climate litigation, that type of climate litigation, suing for past emissions, is going to happen. I'm personally of the view that the problem is not as insurmountable as people think, and that they're actually, if you look to the way liability around water law has been handled in the past, where there have been lots of cases involving multiple polluter scenarios, that there actually are some clear, some clear ways forward that they could evolve into liability. But there, I still think that it would be unlikely that individual engineers would be responsible. I mean, there's a recent paper by Richard Heady that apportions all of the collective responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions to 90, well, not all, there's about 60% or 66%, about two-thirds of total greenhouse gas emissions to 2010 were caused by 90 companies, or 90 entities. About one-third of them are private companies, one-third are state actors, and one-third are state-owned companies. But Chevron is responsible for 3.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions to date. and Exxon Mobil is 3.2%, and there's a list going down from that. And there's a good deal of interest among some circles legally about whether or not you could actually say, well, that means that Chevron is responsible for paying 3.5% of the damages caused by extreme weather events that are linked to climate change. I'm not sure how much detail to go into here because it's a complicated issue. I guess I'd say the webinar that we're offering on April 11th is directed at lawyers primarily, but anyone else is welcome to join. It is because it's for continuing professional development credit for lawyers. It's a pay. You have to pay to participate, but you're welcome to look at it. The rates for non-lawyers are just $20, and you'd be welcome to join us. We have Peter Fremhoff from the Union of Concerned Scientists who will give a legal briefing on what the science can say on causation. And I am personally of the view that it will happen sooner or later, but I think it'll happen first against large-scale emitters like the Exxons or Chevrons or even the Suncors and it'd be some distance down the road that you would even wonder about whether that liability might extend to individual professionals. I think that's a much more challenging task, and even holding the large-scale emitters responsible is a challenging task. But clearly, if you're not advising your, if this type of liability does evolve, either through judge-made common law or through future legislation, and you haven't been advising your clients that there are ways to reduce their emissions and therefore the potential liability, you probably would have breached a sort of responsibility to your client. So it'll be interesting to see how that does evolve, and as I say, I'm of the view that it's much more likely than most lawyers think it is.
Great. Thanks for that, Andrew. We're now actually after 1 o'clock, so I think we need to wrap up. I don't know if Yannick or Andrew want to make any closing statements. I'll just maybe take this opportunity to thank everyone for participating today. That was great to have such a large and involved audience. If you are interested in finding out more about this subject and pursuing sort of the ethical dimensions of climate change, especially how it impacts engineers, I would invite you to join the Engineers for Carbon Ethics. We have a website, carbon-ethics.org. You can find us on Twitter @CarbonEthics, and also on Facebook and LinkedIn if you just search for Engineers for Carbon Ethics. So thanks very much, Andrew, for this very informative presentation. Obviously, there's a lot of subject matter to be covered here. I would encourage anyone who hasn't read Andrew's report that was put out and is available on the West Coast Environmental Law website to read that. There's a lot of good information there. And I wish everyone well in trying to, push this issue or move this issue forward when it comes to both their own personal careers as well as their professional associations. Andrew or Yannick, did you have any closing remarks?
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm sorry to everyone whose questions we didn't reach. I'm really encouraged by the volume of questions. I think people are obviously interested in the issue, and I'm sorry that we didn't have time to get to everyone.
Now, I don't know if this is a possibility, Andrew, but would you be willing to, presumably we're going to have a record of those questions, so some of them we may be able to answer.
I'll try and send an email to some of them, sure. Or maybe all of them, yeah.
That would be good, and we can sort of divide those up.
Thank you all for joining us, and join Carbon Ethics, Engineers for Carbon Ethics, by going to the website carbon-ethics.org to sign up and continue this discussion.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.